God is right beside me in the middle of that. That nothing is hidden from God. A lot of our work might be unseen by the world's eyes or by society's eyes, or not valued by the world. But if we know that we are being faithful to what God has called us, we can know that our work really does matter because God sees and God knows and He remembers.
Welcome to Book Therapy. I'm your host, Kim Patton. There's no way to count how many books are floating around in this world. Some are decent, some are truly terrible, and some are great. Today we're going to take a deep dive into one great book. Together we will discover gems of truth and encouragement to help you face your current season of life. I'm ready, you're ready, let's get this party started. Hello, welcome to another episode of Book Therapy. I have another special interview for you today. I've been following this author for many years, and it was really a privilege to finally get to meet her and talk with her about her book. Before we get to that, I just wanted to say thank you so much for listening, and if you ever have any questions, comments, recommendations, or favorite books that you'd like to hear on the show, you can always contact me through my website, kimpatton.com, and let me know what you've been reading and what your favorite books are, and maybe we'll get them on the show. Okay, on to the interview. Let's dive into the book. Today we are talking about Called to Cultivate, A Gospel Vision for Women in Work by Chelsea Patterson Sobolik. Welcome to the show, Chelsea.
Thank you for having me. This has been a long time coming. We were chatting before we hit record, and it's been a long time coming, so I'm glad to be here.
I knew you from your first book, Longing for Motherhood, Holding on to Hope in the Midst of Childlessness, which meant a lot to me. And I've been following you for a few years. And this book is really interesting because you tackle women in work and the nuance of what it's like for women to cultivate. We are nurturers by nature. That's how God made us. And so throughout the book, I love how you address every woman, every working woman in whatever capacity, whether there's kids involved or taking care of aging parents or in the workforce or at home, self-employed, all those kinds of things. I don't think that you left anyone out. And that meant a lot to me because sometimes we hear women and work and we just think, oh, she's wearing high heels and a pencil skirt and she leaves at 8 a.m. and comes home at 5. And that's not necessarily true. There's so many ways that women interact with work and career. So I'm going to start it off with 3 questions that people ask about their work. And the first question I have is, does anyone see me? I love how on page 23, you are talking about how when we engage in the work of cultivation, we are helping something or someone flourish. And then you give many examples. When a teacher is instructing a classroom, she's cultivating young minds. When a doctor is treating patients, she's cultivating those who need physical healing. When a policymaker advances a piece of legislation, she is cultivating a certain aspect of society. When a mother is changing her baby's diaper or reading her toddler a story, she is cultivating the life of her child. So talk to me about cultivation, flourishing, how women are built to help others grow.
No, I love this. I love this question because it's one I've honestly asked so much of my work is my work mattering? Does anyone see the work I'm doing? And I mean, the reality from, I mean, 99.9% of us is most of our days are very ordinary. We get up, we make breakfast, we go about our work, whatever that looks like. Like you said, I really wanted to be intentional that work inside the home, raising little people is just as valuable. We don't need to pit work inside the home and outside the home against one another because God calls each woman into different seasons of life and work and, stepping in and stepping out. So I will be the first to raise my hand and say I've had seasons that are just so ordinary. It feels like it doesn't even matter, but that's most of life for most of us. And in First Thessalonians, I think it's 4, we're told to live quietly and work with our hands. And throughout the book, and I do trace some of the women who have had very visible impacts on history and society and the world. And those women, I'm so grateful for their work. But the reality is, most of the women throughout human history, we're never going to know their names. We're never going to know their faces. We're never going to know their stories. But their work mattered so deeply because, Christian women throughout history, since the very first woman, have been involved in cultivating society. One of the things that I love about scripture is the creation mandate to be fruitful and multiply, and then cultivate the earth. And it's given to both men and women. One part isn't just given to men, and one part isn't just given to women. It's given to both of them. And so I think something that's encouraged me when I feel like, does anyone see me? Does anyone care about my work? Is remembering God's promise that He will never leave or forsake His children, and that means when I'm changing a diaper again, or this is a real example from this week. I got thrown a ball over in the middle of the night, or I'm typing an email that it feels like no one's going to read. Those types of things that it just kind of feels repetitive or frustrating. That God is right beside me in the middle of that. That nothing is hidden from God. A lot of our work might be unseen by the world's eyes or by society's eyes, or not valued by the world. But if we know that we are being faithful to what God has called us, we can know that our work really does matter because God sees and God knows and He remembers.
You talk about calling an assignment later, and we'll get there because that's one of my favorite parts. But in reading your book, I do feel like you gave me a little bit of the behind the scenes of, I'm holding a book in my hand from you, but you tell me about all of the hard work that goes into writing a book. You tell me about your season of life when you guys were pursuing international adoption, or even when you were writing your first book, you were planning a wedding and you were working and you were changing jobs, and that job change was really difficult for you. It gave me, like, your vulnerability told me that when we're achieving something, there's always behind the scenes daily grind that other people might not see, but you just brought a realness to, the production that everybody sees, and then actually what goes into making that happen. And I love on page 12 where you say, you basically answer this question. Wherever you find yourself, I want to remind you that the Lord sees you and loves you. It might feel like you're working in obscurity or that your work doesn't matter, but as God's child, you are never alone in your work. The Lord has promised never to leave or forsake you, no matter how challenging and overwhelming life feels.
Yes, and I need to put that somewhere where I see it all the time because it's something I forget all the time too.
My second question that we ask ourselves about our work is, what is my unique calling? And I bookmarked this page thinking, you drew a distinction between assignments and calling. And I've always had a beef with my listeners will be like, Kim, you've mentioned this a few times. Thank you. But I've always had a beef with, like, what is God's call in our life? And, what are we made to do? And I feel like when we're 18 to 22, we have that drilled into our brains, like, oh, like, what has God called you to do? And for me growing up, it was like, well, you could be a pastor's wife or a missionary or, a teacher or something. Like, there wasn't a lot of options. And maybe I was a little bit blinded and I didn't see the options that were there to pursue. But I did feel like, especially in the church, there wasn't a spread, there wasn't a palette for me to choose from. It seemed like you kind of go with the most esteemed role. And I kind of wish I could go back and, like, take a career test to figure
Mm.
out what might have really, fit my personality and my gifts and my talents and my strengths. But anyways, that's just, regret from the 90s. But the distinction you put between assignment and calling, on page 58, you talk about different roles and assignments. Some types of roles include friend, daughter, wife, mother, full-time employee, part-time employee, boss, volunteer, serving in the church, grandmother, or caretaker. And then later you say, instead of asking, what is my calling? A better question to ask yourself is, what is my current assignment? So talk to me about that.
Well, first of all, I totally relate by that overwhelming question of what does God put me on this earth to do? And I went to a Christian college, and that was very much in the ethos of what are you made to do? What are you called to do? And I had no earthly idea. So I totally understand that. I love this framing, and it is not original to me. Nancy Ray, I first heard her talk about this. I do give her credit in the book, but it's so helpful because our calling in life for men and women as Christians never changes. Our calling is to faithfully follow Christ, glorify Him, love our neighbor. That never changes. And we can do that no matter what assignment we're in or season of life. And honestly, that's really freeing because, you know, take, for example, this little short season of maternity leave I had. My assignment for those 3 months was to be home full time with Deb and not working outside the home. I'm back at work now. But so my assignments, even in the past couple of months, have changed. So our assignments change all the time. Our seasons of life change all the time. And what happens when we place the crux of our calling in life on an assignment, whether it's to be someone's spouse, to work at a certain job, to work in a certain occupation, to go to a certain church, what happens when we place um, the weight of our calling onto those assignments is when they change, and they inevitably will, it can feel like we can feel like we're standing on quicksand. I read a biography last year on Elizabeth Elliot. It's a two-part biography by Ellen Vaughn. And something that really struck me was Elizabeth Elliot was assigned to three different marriages and three different men throughout her life. And um, you know, that strikes me because for a season she was called to be Jim Elliot's wife, and then she was called to be single, and then called to be married again. And so I think it's really helpful for us um, as we're kind of living life, for me at least, as we're living life, to remember that our calling never changes, and our calling in as men and women are the same. Of course, there's very big differences in how we live out that calling, but it never changes. And there's a lot of freedom in that because, um, I've had 5 different jobs in my 10 years in DC. And if I had placed all of my weight on working on Capitol Hill and that fell apart, um, they're never meant to bear that weight. So I think it's really freeing for us to say, what is the assignment God has placed me in today? The reality too is some of our assignments we don't like. We will, one of the promises of scripture is that we're going to walk through hard seasons and suffering. And that's hard to say. It's not pleasant to acknowledge, but it's a reality that we're going to have seasons of life that are very unpleasant and that are very difficult. And some seasons of suffering might last until eternity. It might not be over until our time on earth is over. But kind of going back to what I said earlier, knowing that no season is wasted, and God is present and with us in every season and in every assignment, again, is a deep comfort for me in as I'm navigating both seasons of joy and assignments of joy, and then um, harder seasons too.
This plays into our identity. I'm hearing you talking about the weight that we place on assignments. And while calling is a broader theme of our life, assignment is going to be more specific. And I don't know how many times in the last few years, because we've moved several times, not just different homes, but different cities and states, I have worried about what people think because I'm placing my identity on a city or a church or a job and what people think of me. And so I've been thinking recently about identity and how when I'm frazzled about what people are thinking, it's because I'm placing my identity in either their opinion or whatever I'm holding on to at that moment, whether it's a job or a persona or a, whatever I'm going through. So that's very interesting that we can change assignments and yet still fall into kind of the safety of an overall calling, which is to love God and love each other. You do have some very specific questions that we can ask on page 63, and we won't get into this, but I would encourage my listeners to buy the book because it helps you process through, what is my deep gladness? What lights up my heart? What practical needs does my work help meet? What are the deep needs in my church, community, and world? What do others see in me? What do they believe I'm good at? There's so many books and resources about figuring out, how to be your best self. But I think when it comes to women and work, there is a sense of you want to choose something that matches you and what other people have already encouraged you to pursue. Those are really great questions to ask. So that brings us to our third question, which you probably feel very acutely at this point in time. How do you balance it all? How do we balance it all? And what I mean by that is the pressure to do well at home and to do well in work and to serve the Lord, and to honestly even embrace failure and setbacks and mistakes, and how to do that with not only a good attitude, but just like a teachable spirit. And I find that very challenging. So you have some practical tips. The first thing you talk about on page 76 is something that I've been hearing from you for years. And I think that practically I've done it maybe once or twice, but every time I hear it from you, I'm like, oh gosh, Chelsea, that's such a good tip because it makes so much sense. So you say, to help counter forgetfulness, I've started carving out a few minutes midday to quiet my mind and spend a few moments in silent prayer. If I have time, I also try to read a psalm or another passage of scripture. This small rhythm helps reorient my gaze back to the Lord and remind me of his purpose and vision for my life and work. Pausing to pray doesn't have to take much time, but the payoff has been extraordinary for me.
I forget all the time to do this, but a couple of months ago, set an alarm on my phone midday to remind me. And that's been really, really helpful to just, I don't know if I put this in the book, but you start off your day with the best intentions, and it's not really quiet for the 2.5-year-old, but you start off your day with the best of intentions. And then usually by noon or one for me, it's just off the rails already. And I'm a huge fan. Every Moment Holy, they're collections of liturgies. They actually have one for midday, and they have an app. It's pretty short. I'll usually read over that or just take a minute or two, and it really, really does help reset me for the day, and it's been really helpful.
You also say that balancing everything doesn't have to be, I don't know how to word this. I heard this from Sandy Cooper because I was asking her, like, she has the Balanced Momcast, I think is what it's called. Yeah, Balanced Momcast. And I'm like, well, what do you mean by balance? Because I feel super unbalanced. And she's like, well, I do feel like it's a pendulum. And in your book, you talk about riding your bike. Your weight must be constantly shifting. The same goes with our lives. I've spoken much about seasons of life throughout this book. That concept comes into sharp focus in this chapter. Our seasons will dictate where the weight of our time, energy, and attention go. I love this because we go back to assignment. What is your assignment right now? There was, last semester, I was a preschool teacher, which was totally a fluky thing. I don't, yeah, I know. I don't even know how it happened. It just kind of happened. And I'm like, wow, that's going to be on my resume forever. And I don't know how I feel about that. But it was a season and it was an assignment. And as it got towards the end, like October, November, I thought, you know what? I don't think I'm going to be doing this very much longer. I'm going to embrace it because I can actually see how temporary this is. So that felt to me like a really short assignment that had its challenges, and everyone would always ask me, like, how's it going? Do you like it? And I'm like, I mean, it has pros and cons. Like, there's some parts that are really cool about it. There's some parts that are stinking headache and I can't even think straight.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that God called me to do that because even though it was a short, small assignment, it gave me a lot of perspective. And just like this whole balance thing, like when you're in an assignment, there's going to be things that you have to say no to for a couple of months or maybe years, but it doesn't mean you're saying no to it forever. So tell me about that.
People have so many strong opinions on the concept of balance. And I mean, I think the concept of balance basically implies that we can and should be giving the equal amounts of attention to all areas of life. And all areas of life don't deserve equal amounts of attention, at least not at one time, because we are finite, limited beings. And we were chatting before we hit record. We're both Enneagram threes. I would work all day and all night if I could. I love work. So what the struggle is for me is saying, okay, work cannot and should not get the bulk of the best of me. It should get 8 hours of the best of me that I'm paid for, but I'm not paid to do 14 hours worth of work. And so I think all of life shouldn't get equal amounts of attention. Think of exercise. We don't exercise 8 hours a day every day. And so that's proportion to a day and a week. And so I think something that's been really, really helpful for me is reshifting my vision, because I think for so long I was trying to find the perfect planner, the perfect system, the perfect way to set life and almost let it run on autopilot for the next year. And that's just not reality. The reality is, especially for women, so much of life changes day to day, week to week. A kid's homesick, that changes your whole day. I mean, so much for women, especially, we step in, we step out, is just not as linear as our male counterparts' worlds can tend to be. And so it's been helpful for me to shift my perspective and say, I'm not going to find this perfect app or system or planner that's going to allow me to set and forget it or allow me to balance everything so that I feel like I'm just acing everything. As a Christian, I need grace in the areas that I will inevitably fail in or feel like I'm failing in. I need to be reminded that I am a person with limits who gets tired at 8 p.m. every day and needs 8 hours. And these things that we're not robots, and we're not designed to do it all. At least not all at once. And so it's been helpful for me to kind of constantly be reevaluating where what needs attention this week, this month. What are some of those things that help me show up to work and be my best, show up to my family and be my best? For me, I exercise helps me so much mentally. Getting outside, um, taking a hot second to I'm an introvert, so taking a hot second to myself. But those are my things. They might be totally different from someone else. And so again, this shift for me from kind of figuring out a way to balance it all or set it and forget it to that's not reality. And what reality is for a lot of women is kind of constantly, it's like riding a bike,
Mhm.
shifting your weight, or and that's hard to say because it means that there's a lot of work involved in that. But I think for a lot of us in the Western world, that is our reality, that we need to constantly be praying through, thinking through, having wisdom about where we give our time and
Mhm.
energy.
Mhm. My mentor is always telling me disappointment happens when your expectations don't meet reality. And we have this expectation that we can set a system in place that makes us perfect human beings. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's a way to do it right. There's got to be. There's a way
Yes.
for me to be the best mom. There's a way for me to never get upset. Like no. There's actually not.
No.
Um and
And I think
grace.
too, it's so easy. And I fall into this all the time where I get on Instagram and I see all these other women who seemingly have it all together or seemingly wake up at 5 a.m. every morning and I have all these things that I want and I feel like I can't have. And so it's so easy to compare and to imagine that, well, she has it all together, or she has X, Y, and Z, and that's just not reality. But I mean, almost daily fall into that. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, and that is I feel like that's going to be a struggle for women across the board, because that's what we hear from most women, is that we see it in someone else and we assume that we can apply it to our lives. And there's just
Mhm.
this disconnect of, but we can't. That's not true.
Mhm.
They have struggles behind closed doors that I don't even want to know about. We just have to
Mhm.
remember that when we see the best of
Yes.
people,
Yes.
that they have stuff going on behind the scenes.
That's such a good way to put it. I really, really like that.
So we're going to have to wrap it up. We asked ourselves a few questions of, just like, does anyone see me? What is my unique calling? And how do I balance it all? And I like what you talked about at the end about limits. And your husband wrote you a poem called The Girl in the Sea. And you share it with us at the end of the book, which is really beautiful. And I think that you are a woman who kind of wants to save the world and doesn't feel like there should be limits. And you're trying so hard. You have this spoon at the edge of the sea, and your husband sees the work that you're doing, and your husband sees your efforts. And I think what you're trying to convey in this book is that we have a healthy desire to cultivate, to help people flourish, to be important, to meet needs. That's not a bad thing. What our problem is, we don't have grace for ourselves in seeing that our work really does matter, and kind of putting on the lens that God has on our lives, which is your ordinary moments matter, and you are helping people flourish, and you are helping people get through their day. So I loved your book. Thank you so, so
Thank
much for
you.
for sharing it with the world and for putting in the effort. And is there anything else you want to say? And also, please give us an adoption update.
Yes. Well, I think I would just reiterate to anyone listening that, like you just said, your work does matter and God sees you and is present in those moments. It feels like it doesn't. So cling to um, that hope and that reality that our work today matters and it also matters for eternity. And then adoption update. So my husband and I returned home from India at the end of last year, where we adopted our son Dev. He's 2.5 years old and just the cutest little boy on planet Earth. I'm biased, but he's incredible and learning English so quickly. And we ended up being in India much, much longer than we ever anticipated. And for anyone who's familiar with adoption, bonding is a huge, huge part of the initial stages. And um, I myself was adopted internationally. So Dev and I share how we both joined our family, but being in India for so long, we had nothing to do but look at each other and play and be together. And that did help quite a lot with his transition home to the US. That we had 5 weeks together in his home country to be together. So definitely a transition. Motherhood's a huge transition, but a wonderful one too.
Thank you so, so much, Chelsea. This has been wonderful. And we kind of already talked, but maybe your next book, will tell more of your story, or who knows what God is going to call you to do next. But I just so appreciate what you have shared through your books, through your online presence, through your emails. It has really, really, truly helped me grow these past few years.
Thank you. And thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Book Therapy. Today I talked with Chelsea Patterson Sobolik about her book, Called to Cultivate. You can visit her website, chelseapattersonsobolik.com, and also her Instagram. She has some really cute photos and videos of her little family, their newly adopted son, Dev. Chelsea's a great person to follow online. She has a monthly newsletter, and she always has tips and tricks in there about how to rest well, how to balance life and work and family and all that. And I really look up to her and look forward to reading more books from her in the future. Okay, that's it for today. See you next time.